Welcome back to the Innovative Agency, everybody. It's Sharon Torek here with you again today, and looking forward to another great conversation. And it has been a bit since we have had a guest on the show who has sort of straddled both sides of understanding the agency experience. Every once in a while, we'll have someone who's been on the client side of marketing and on the agency side of marketing. And today, though, I'm excited. We've got somebody who's transitioned from being an agency owner, like many of you, who now advises agency owners and counsels them and helps them implement. And so Tudor Dumitrescu, who is the founder of TANDA Digital, is with me today. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Welcome. And thank you for joining me all the way from Bucharest in Romania.
Sharon, it's my great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. First of all, I think your story, well, your reasoning behind your story of transitioning from being an agency owner to advising agency owners and growing their businesses is really interesting. And so let's start there for a second and maybe set the stage and talk a bit about how and why you decided to make the transition from owning an agency to owning a business that advises them. Because I really love your why behind this story.
Thank you, Sharon. I mean, that's a great question. And the reason why basically is I used to run a direct response agency, and we used to work mostly in finance and also health and wellness, mostly with US-based companies. And it was great. I enjoyed the work, but what I didn't like so much is that I couldn't actually see the impact that my work had on people. Right, I would see the impact that it had on the bottom line of companies. You drove this much growth and so on and so forth, and that was cool. There's nothing wrong with that, but I felt deep inside my heart that I also wanted to see the impact that my work actually had in changing people's lives. So I looked at the skill set that I built in actually building that agency, and I realized that there were a lot of people who didn't actually have these types of skills. And the way I approached it is that when I built my first agency, I was basically a business person and a salesperson. That's my background. Those are the things that I was good at. And it took me some time to realize that most agency founders, they're actually creatives. And a lot of the time, the things that are holding them back is the sales skills and the sales process and that whole area of business development that they just don't have much experience with. Many agency owners end up being very good when it comes to referrals. And for example, when I talk with them and I ask them, what's your usual conversion rate on a sales call, things of that nature, they would tell me that, well, it's 50%, 60%, some of them even 80%. And I just dig a bit further and I find out that that was actually their conversion rate on referrals. And when they actually try to apply the same thing on a cold audience, basically people who didn't know them or who were not outright looking for their service, their conversion rates would drop below 10%. So that was a big thing. And initially I did this sort of work as a consultant, and then obviously we decided to also implement them because some of the agencies had trouble when it came to the actual implementation. So that's a bit about the background and the why. Let me know if you would like me to clarify any of the aspects.
Yeah, no, well, I think what I would love to talk about, because I was able to do a little bit of reading myself about your perspective, and I really think it would be helpful to agency owners listening for us to have a conversation about your point of view related to what works well and what doesn't work as well for agencies when it comes to doing business development in 2024, because you're very thoughtful about this. You even taken time to rank some of these things, and some of the tactics and techniques are lower on your list, but you don't discount them altogether. And so I thought it was very insightful. And so let's talk a little bit about what was your process sort of for coming up with your list, if you will, or how did you develop this perspective? Was it trial and error as an agency owner or what you've seen your clients go through?
It's really, I would say, a combination of both. And also a lot of thinking about the situation and why certain things work and why certain things don't. Most of our clients and the clients that I enjoy working most in terms of the agency space are B2B agencies, basically agencies that work with organizations, just because that's also what I've done in the past. And I have a lot of expertise and experience with that. And I also enjoy working in that sort of business development framework, which is a bit different to agencies that serve consumers. So, for example, there's a lot of agencies out there that work, let's say, with landscaping companies or with plumbers. And those agencies I consider more on the B2C front
Mhm.
because their clients, they're usually small businesses or smaller businesses. And they don't really need that level of business development where it comes to basically building long-term relationships, being able to navigate an organizational structure in order to push a sale forward and drive a sale forward. Um, so that's one of the big distinctions. And the agencies that target more the B2C sort of businesses, like plumbers, they target the end client. Usually, those types of agencies, for example, methods that we rank low, for example, running advertisements can work well, right, for their clients. The same with methods like cold calling, that we also rank lower down in the spectrum. Whereas on the B2B side of things, most of the time it's basically all about the relationship and actually being able to build relationships with people. So things like, for example, networking through LinkedIn, building a personal brand, things of that nature are going to do a lot better in that space,
Mhm.
because it's a more sophisticated space. Right. And you probably know this from your own work. The B2B space is usually um, a lot more sophisticated than the B2C space. So therefore, the marketing techniques that are used for each one differ. So that's sort of why we have that ranking and some of the thinking that went behind actually building it. We've also run tests, like obviously we've run a lot of ads. We've spent tens of thousands of dollars running ads, for example, for ourselves. And we know the difference in terms of the quality of the traffic that you can get. It's one thing when you know who the decision maker is, for example, and you decide to reach out to them and build a relationship with them via LinkedIn, let's say. And it's another thing when you have this ad running, let's say on Facebook, and somebody's scrolling on Facebook, they see the ad, and then they click the ad and they go through a sort of funnel. What we've noticed is that generally the people that you get off Facebook, they're lower quality leads, in the sense that they usually churn faster, they have less money, especially in the B2B space that we're familiar with. This is most of what happens. Whereas when you get to choose your clients on LinkedIn, you have a lot more control who you're going after. You're actually building a relationship with them before you actually do any selling, and that tends to work a lot better. Those people are much higher quality, both in terms of the financial strength of their organizations, but also in terms of the relationship that you can build with them. They're a lot more interested in building a relationship. Whereas the people that would come from ads, they're just a lot more transactional, basically. So those I would say are the biggest differences.
Okay. So I have so many questions for you, but I think the first thing that I wanted to ask, and I don't want to, I don't want to, I'm going to give a spoiler alert here because I want everybody to read your article about your ranking of business building techniques for agencies. But to give away the punchline a little bit, you are a very, very strong advocate for brand building on LinkedIn as a business development tactic for B2B agencies. So I have a couple questions for you. The first is, do you have a perspective on whether agency owners or leaders should be building their personal individual brands as thought leaders on LinkedIn or whether they should be building the thought leadership in the name of the organization on that channel? Have you seen one work better than the other? And I'm curious how you feel about that.
That's a very good question. Usually it's good to have a combination of both, but primarily it should be the personal brand of the founder, because most agencies end up being about relationships with people. That's the foundation of this sort of service-led business. It's not like when your company has a product and you're just basically reselling that product. In an agency, the value is not basically in a product, it's within the skill set, within the network, and within the capabilities of the people of that agency. And the most important people are obviously the leadership of the agency. So whether that's a single founder or for a larger agency, it's their leadership team, that those are the people that should be most active and actually building their personal brand, because any organization that will want to work with the agency, with the company, is going to look at who the leaders are first and choose the agency on that basis. So that's why personal brands tend to be a lot more effective. It also brings a degree of trust and a degree of security that you don't have, so to speak, with a faceless company, because you have a person in front of you, and the person who basically vouches for the company with their reputation and with their track record and with their history, which is very, very powerful. So, I mean, if you look at even some of the largest or fastest growing agencies out there, like let's say VaynerMedia, Gary Vee's company, you will notice that they're basically built around the founder. And this is something that I see very frequently in pretty much all digital service type of businesses. Just because, as I said, ultimately the value is in the expertise of the people. It's not in a product that's separate from that expertise.
Mhm. How do you, what I see a lot of agencies struggle with is that when the personal brand of the founder or leader of the agency is strong, they sometimes see that as a barrier to scaling because they feel like they've got too much personal imprint on the various pieces and parts of the business. So, how do you counsel some of your clients, for example, who are agency owners, to avoid that trap so that they can use the brand building to grow the agency so it rests on their shoulders, as you say, but they're not actually doing all the things that it takes to service clients, run a strong and profitable business, all the things that I think a lot of agency owners get trapped in, and then their capacity runs out because they're full because they've got too much going on that they have their hands in on an everyday basis. So, how do you help square those things with some of the agency leaders who you've worked with?
It depends ultimately on the scale of the agency. So the biggest agencies we've worked with were around the 6 million revenue per year mark.
Mhm.
At that level, obviously, it's about having systems and people in place that can handle pretty much every aspect of the day-to-day running of the business without you. And the agency owner is pretty much in a position of representation for the business
Mhm.
rather than actually being involved in the business and actively running it. Of course, I mean, in every sort of agency business, you are going to have some clients who are more important than other clients, whether because they're more prestigious clients, and therefore, even though they may not be as valuable monetarily, you're going to pay more attention to them because they can lead to an amazing case study, which can open many more doors for you. So that's one thing. Or you're going to have clients that are financially much bigger than others, and therefore they're going to get more attention. So obviously, in situations like that, the owner can have elements of involvement with such clients and such projects. But the main function of the owner should be to actually represent the agency in the outside world and in the market. And that's basically a function of their personal brand, their reputation, and their network. That becomes the highest leverage activity that they can do. So much like yourself, for example, you're doing it with your podcast. You're also appearing on other people's podcasts, which I've also seen. That thought leadership sort of activity that you're doing is the highest leverage activity that you could be doing. Whereas the actual service implementation itself and even the sales and marketing side can be outsourced. Of course, at smaller levels of agencies, including, for example, ourselves, I'm not very involved in the actual delivery of the services apart from coaching and working directly with a few specific clients. But
Right.
apart from that sort of work, I have my team who does pretty much everything else. We are 12 people today. So I rely on my team to actually be able to implement and drive projects forward for clients. And I just sort of come in if something is not going right. That's sort of the moment when I decide that, look, I actually have to step in here for a bit and get the boat, on the straight line. So that's sort of one side, the service delivery. The other side now is going to be sales and marketing. For us, I'm pretty much full-time involved in sales and marketing, and I do this for every customer pretty much that comes in. And this is actually one of the things that I've struggled to keep up with doing.
Right.
Last year, I think I was spending 20 plus hours per week selling to people and actually speaking with people, networking, and all of these activities together. So at a certain stage, it's fine for the owner to be involved in the sales and marketing side. Once you reach a certain scale, let's say above 2-3 million, that's usually when you start seeing the owner break away from the sales and marketing roles, and they may be involved with the biggest clients, right? But they're not going to be involved with every single client that comes through, and they're going to start building a sales team, putting a sales team in place, and actually that's what's going to enable them to scale further. And once they're at that point, pretty much their only focus should actually be on representation and on managing their organization. I
Got
hope
it.
that answered the question. It's a complex answer, right? But I hope that I could
No, it does.
summarize it well.
And yeah, no, it does. It's very helpful. I think that it's just good to be reminded as an agency owner or leader that you only have so much personal bandwidth, and anything you can hear or read to reinforce that how you choose to spend your time during the week, which are your higher value activities, is important. I mean, and the repetition of it is important. I mean, I need to hear it myself as the owner of a business on a regular basis, because it's very tempting when you've built it from the ground up yourself, which many of our listeners have done, to leave some of those details in the hands of other folks as you are, graduating to more high profit activities on behalf of the business. So I appreciate the perspective for sure.
It's
And
hard. I mean, it's hard
yeah,
because you have the expectation that they will perform up here the same as you, but usually that's not the case. And you have to build the systems that can handle, let's say, 70-80% of the performance that you could deliver on those tasks, and learn to be okay with that.
exactly.
And
That's the hard
psychologically,
part.
it is a big problem
Yeah.
psychologically. And it's hard to get through it sometimes because it's just about being able to readjust your standards.
Mhm.
It's one of the most important things that you have to ultimately learn as a leader, in my opinion. Being able to work with other people, outsource other people to other people, and give them the freedom. Because in the end, if you don't give them the freedom, they don't get a chance to develop. And no matter which direction they end up developing in, it's going to be a different direction than the one that you would have taken.
Right.
And you need to give them that freedom, because unless you give them that freedom, the business is going to start stagnating. I've actually worked with agency owners who were stuck for years around, let's say, the 1.5 million to 2 million, 2.5 million level, and they couldn't get past that. And for most of them, it was one of this issue. They were so stuck on the quality of the work. The quality of the work had to always be up to their standards. Things had to always be done the way they wanted it to be done. And they could push with that up to a level, right? But it's not scalable beyond a
Right.
certain point. And you sort of have to give up control for more growth.
Very true. And also be open to your way not always being the most effective way for someone else to implement or execute. because sometimes their system, their process is faster for them than the one that you believe is faster or better. So it is, yeah, it's a constant growth exercise for actually the owner of any agency or service business, but it's one that we all have to continue to be uncomfortable in so that we get better at it and create some more space for our team to do what they do, what we're paying them to do, right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. Um, the other thing that I really was curious to get your perspective about is agency owners are experiencing, at least in the US, I'm not sure what you're seeing in Europe right now, but much longer sales cycles. And the tactics that seem to work best for B2B business development take the longest, in my personal opinion. Establishing a platform of thought leadership is not an overnight thing. It's not a 6-month thing. It's a year after year exercise of putting the time in, developing the relationships, creating the content, doing the learning that you have to do of your client industry. And meanwhile, the clients, once you do have an opportunity to get in front of them, they're taking longer to decide. How are you helping agencies work through what this means for their cash flow, and the waiting games that they have to play, as a result of how they've chosen to build their businesses?
I mean, Sharon, I think this is a good point for me to sort of introduce how I actually think about branding and thought leadership for agencies generally. The
Mhm,
way I look at it, it's sort of like your branding and your thought leadership. It's sort of like the level of the ocean, right? The ocean is at a certain level and there's boats and all sorts of stuff on it. The boats are your other strategies, like for example, outreach, cold calling, emailing, and so on. When you raise the level of the ocean, right, you raise the level of your brand with thought leadership, with a stronger personal brand, what happens is that all of those assets that are sitting on the ocean rise along with the ocean, right? So they become a lot more effective. So that's sort of how I look at the value of thought leadership. The value of thought leadership is not in actually bringing you the clients. It's in building the authority that's going to make it easier to, number one, gain access to those clients and have them pay attention to you.
mhm,
And number two, help you in the sales conversion process, right? But those are not the tactics that are going to get you business and get you business today and shorten sales cycles. Because you're absolutely right. We see the same thing in Europe. There is a looming recession. A lot of companies are slashing down on their marketing budgets, on budgets that they allocate to design and to other activities that are done by creative agencies. And what that means is that only the strong agencies who actually have a strong sales process end up surviving. And let me explain what I mean by that. Most agencies get a large majority of their business, and I would say that on average, this is 60-70% plus of their business from referrals or from their network, whether that means attending networking events, people knowing them, and so on and so forth.
mhm.
Um, they don't really have, because they're creative people at their foundation, they don't really have the experience that's required to build a sales process that can convert a cold audience, somebody who doesn't know them, doesn't trust them, except obviously through their personal brand, through what they have out there in the media. And so they end up competing for the same class of clients. And these are basically the clients who are already looking for the services that they offer. And there's two situations with those clients. Either they know them from their network, in which case, when they need a service, they immediately reach out to them, or they don't, right? If they don't know them from their network, the only way they can get to those clients is pretty much when those clients are price shopping and searching for them. And obviously, when they're price shopping, they're looking at many different other agencies.
Right.
What that means is obviously longer sales cycles because it takes more for them to choose a provider, and also they're shopping on price, which puts a pressure on the margins of the agency. So those tend to be not very good clients. The way I think about it is that there is no unfulfilled demand in the agency market. Pretty much as soon as demand appears, it gets fulfilled.
Mhm,
So the real trick And the
So
real
true.
question,
That's so true.
yes, exactly. So the real trick and the real question here becomes, how do we actually generate demand? Right? And that's what agency owners have to learn how to do. And this is where I say, because most agency owners, if you sort of ask them, if you could have one thing, what would that thing be? They're like, oh, we just want more meetings. If we have more meetings, we're going to be happy. And this comes back to the problem with the sales cycle, and the fact that they're used to closing referrals. They're not actually aware very often about the issues that they have with their sales process. And so they expect a cold audience who's not even looking for their service to basically buy right away. And to just understand the value of their service. And that doesn't happen. So usually with a cold audience, the real magic comes when you learn to have a conversation with somebody where you get them to become aware of problems that they were not even conscious of before they spoke with your agency. And these are going to be problems that your expertise and your internal system that you've built inside your agency can actually solve. So the first stage is you get them to become aware of a problem that they didn't know of before. I call this stage sort of illuminating a new problem for them. Once you illuminate the problem, you have to illuminate the consequences of that problem, of not solving that problem, not dealing with it, not taking any action on it. Because if they don't see those consequences as significant for their organization, as impacting the growth of their organizations, or the costs that their organizations are facing, or the goals that their organizations have, they're not actually going to take action on it. So most agencies, the way they sell is pretty much by sort of bypassing all this process and looking at the people who have already solved these problems for themselves. They figured out what the problem is. They figured out what the consequences of the problem are and that it's worth solving. And now they're just looking for a provider to actually bridge the gap for them. Whereas if you go and you come back to what I was saying initially, how do you generate demand? The answer is that you have to do this work for people as part of your sales process. And that's sort of where the magic happens, because you can have impactful conversations with people where you get them to understand problems and think about problems that they didn't even think about before, and understand how those problems impact their goals and their organization, and therefore open them up to a sale that didn't exist before, right? These were not people who were looking for your services. And when you can do that, you can actually generate demand for your agency. You can already be positioned from the beginning as a high-level, basically, consultant who is a value in itself to the buyer. So you're in pole position, so to speak, to actually get that business. They're not price shopping at that point. They trust you at that point, and the deal can actually go through. Now, the problem here is that most agency owners, number one, they lack the systems to be able to build a pipeline and nurture it over time. And they also lack the know-how of actually designing the sales systems and having these sort of conversations with people where they can help them see problems that they weren't aware of before. Because just the way most of us have been taught to think about selling, it's sort of like you have a product, maybe it's this pen, and the challenge is, just start selling it. Whereas you have to go a bit further back in the process, and you have to go back to the people and the organizations that you're helping, and you ask yourself, what problems are these organizations facing in today's market? What trends are going on in today's market that may influence what they're trying to achieve or what they're trying to do? And then help enlighten them to the problems that stand ahead in their path, help them create a plan and the vision for the future that they can navigate through. And then the sale opens up. So most agency owners, I would say, they struggle when it comes to closing cold clients or a cold audience of clients, just because they don't have this middle bit of the process, that they never actually open the sale.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so that's pretty much my vision for this. And the way we actually help people through this is on LinkedIn. Not only do we help them build their personal brand and their thought leadership, which is essential because it powers all of this other work, right? If somebody doesn't trust you, If they don't see you as an expert in what you do, they're not going to listen to you, right? It's going to be
Right.
impossible for you to actually apply these other tactics. So
Yeah.
that's sort of the foundation, right? But it's not enough to actually speed up the sales cycles and get more business on demand. The other side is actually being able to outreach to these people, and instead of pitching your services and what you do, have conversations that are going to actually give them value and help you identify if they have the sort of issues that you can solve for them and that would be worth solving in the first place for them.
Right. Well, and I love how this integrates with your point of view around being effective at creating the transition for the client that the client wants to see. I mean, as you express it, the job of agencies is to create some transition in their client that their client wants effectively. And it doesn't matter what tactic you're using or what technology you're using. And it might be a bunch of them and they may change from time to time. It's what is the transformation that the client wants to see and how is that measured? And that aligns perfectly with what you described about demand creation. Help them understand that they have a need that they didn't even realize was there to help them make the transformation that they want to make. So I love looking at it from that point of view, because then you can be agnostic about how you help them get there. You're not tied to any particular means or method, which I think is fascinating. And I could have you on 5 more times to talk about this. This is fascinating, but uh, I will have you back and ask you many, many more questions about this. But meanwhile, why don't we tell folks how they can find Tanda and how they might reach out to you to learn more about what you do?
Well, first, Sharon, that was a wonderful summary. Your understanding of our system and how we think about things is amazing. It's very clear to me that you've read through what we do and how we do things. So that's wonderful, and
Thank
I
you.
really
That's my job.
appreciate that. I mean, I've been on a lot of podcasts, and the reason I say this is that there's not a lot of hosts that actually put this level of effort to actually understand the guests that they have on. So I think that this is really valuable and really precious, and I just wanted to take an opportunity to basically thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Um,
I appreciate that, Tandor.
It's my pleasure. Now, with regards to Tanda and how people can find us, so obviously we have our website, tanda.digital. They can go on our website and learn more about what we do. They can also connect with me on LinkedIn. In terms of how people can work with us, we generally have two methods of working with us. We have a program where basically we give them access to a learning platform. They have access to all our methodologies, all our know-how, a
Mhm.
community of agency owners in there, and group coaching that I do once every 2 weeks with everybody who has issues. That's one way to work with us, and that's usually for agencies that are more beginner level, let's say, or less established, where they would be actually be implementing everything for themselves. The other option is working with us basically as a service provider. That's, so to speak, our main business, our main focus, where we actually work with larger agencies. I would say our sweet spot is agencies that are doing around, let's say, 200K per year on the low end, up to 1 to 3 million.
Mhm.
Um, that's sort of the sweet spot. We've worked with some bigger agencies and obviously with some smaller agencies, but that's sort of the sweet spot where we actually do what we do as a service for them. And we have multiple service options. They can do part of the work themselves. We can do part of the work for them, depending on what actually aligns most with their structure as an organization and also their goals in the long term and how they actually want to develop.
Mhm.
Most of the time, we work around LinkedIn in terms of the thought leadership, the content, and also in terms of the outreach. For some agencies, we also do cold email. It really depends on what the agency needs and also what market space they're active in. Because one thing that many people don't realize, it's not ultimately about one tactic being superior to another. And I think you sort of caught onto this from our article. Even though we have a ranking, you have to understand which tools, so to speak, are the best for which situation. And the
Right.
situation involves the agency you're working with, the market, the assets that they have access to, and so on. So, for example, we know that an audience like startup founders, for, let's say, tech startups that have been funded, the best way to connect with them is LinkedIn. Whereas if you ask me, what's the best way to connect with plumbers and do so at scale, I would tell you, don't waste your time on LinkedIn, because plumbers, even if they have an account there, and there's a lot of them on LinkedIn, 90% plus, and this is something that most people don't know, are actually inactive on LinkedIn. So
Mm.
what's going to happen is you're going to connect with so many people, and your acceptance rate is going to be like 2-3%. And you may be thinking it's something to do with your profile or how you're reaching out, but that's not actually true. It's just the fact that they don't open LinkedIn up, right?
Right.
So they just don't open it up. They don't see your connection request. They don't get your messages. They don't read your messages. And all of this is basically controlled by the fact that on LinkedIn, people need to have reasons to be active there. A startup founder is active there because they want to network with other founders. They're there to network with investors. They're there to find potential teammates and employees. Whereas somebody like a plumber, right, they're not finding their employees from LinkedIn. They're not networking with other founders. They're not looking for investors usually, right? So why would they be active on LinkedIn?
Right.
So
Right.
this is sort of the big difference there.
Right. And that's a
But
great
yeah,
example.
we try to basically match the founder and the agency really with the method that's most effective for them.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom today. This has been a great conversation, a lot of learning for me as the owner of a firm that does service providing. And I know agencies are going to get a lot out of the conversation as well. So, Tudor, thank you so much for joining me today on the Innovative Agency. I've so enjoyed our conversation.
It's been my great pleasure, Sharon.
Mine as well. All right, everyone. Thank you also for joining me today. It's been great to be with you again, and we will see you on the next episode. And until then, be well.